All right, Anna, whenever you want to start us off.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the newest iteration of the Culture and Contemporary Live series for the culture section of ASA. Today's topic is going to be global media and politics. My name is Anna Velichkova, and I'm a Croft Associate Professor of Sociology and International Studies, and I'm co-hosting this panel with Emma Brand, who is a postdoc at the University of Waterloo. She studies youth media in Serbia, and she will be introducing the panel and running the discussion, and I'll be kind of in the background and collecting questions for the end of the session. So without further ado, Emma, please introduce our panelists today. Thank you all for being here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Anna. I'm Emma, as Anna said, and I'm going to introduce our panelists today. First of all, we have Kenzie Burchill. Kenzie Burchill is an associate professor in journalism and information studies at University of Toronto. His recent book, A Constant Disconnection: The Weight of Everyday Digital Life, examines the tension between labor and platform power from the individual's perspective, and he leads the Beyond Disinformation Research Network, focusing on policy responses to the development and export of authoritarian templates for disinformation, censorship, and surveillance. Secondly, we have Yuan Shao. Yuan Shao is an assistant professor of sociology at Yale University. His major work explores the areas of political communication, digital media, social networks, and collective action. He's especially interested in studying sociological questions from an international and comparative perspective. And third, we have Jeffrey Swindle. Jeffrey Swindle is a college fellow and lecturer at Harvard, and he is just starting as an assistant professor at UC Irvine. He studies the global spread of cultural ideas, and he is currently focused on transnational liberal networks. So thank you so much to all our wonderful panelists for being here today. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. To get started off, I'm going to ask you all to talk about what kinds of media you examine in your research. What are some political and cultural dimensions of these media? Why are these media important nowadays? And how do they affect people's lives? Dr. Burchill, if you'd like to start.
Great, thank you so much. So this is a tough question. The what media do you work with? Do you research? What isn't media today? Right? What part of our lives have not been mediatized, have not been retranslated or mediated into media practices or media uses? So I've got sort of two pools of research. One is everyday sociological life, everyday experiences, everyday tensions, everyday contradictions that are part and parcel of our digital lives, and really find us constantly connected, but also constantly finding ways to disconnect or overconnect that leaves us disconnected from others. And so in many ways, it's this tension politically that why won't you leave me alone? Email, social media, texting, telephone, telephones, but also why won't you let me participate in the wider world movements, the wider politics, wider community engagements, right? So there's that tension in the everyday space, and that's sort of one bucket of media that I engage with. But then the other bucket of media that I engage with is news media. And so for the last 10 years, I've been basically since the Sochi Olympics and since Crimea was first invaded by Russia, I've been really trying to keep up with how the information landscape, that news circulates in, and also the landscape and context within which news is produced, how that's changing. And what press conventions, what production practices, what citizen engagement, what military or governmental interventions are changing that landscape. So really, I've been doing rapid response, iterative, but also methodologically and modally promiscuous studies. So large-scale quant and metadata studies of news production, of news flows and circulation. And then I look for the glitches in those. I look for when the patterns don't work out as expected, and that prompts close readings, qualitative case studies. So this started with comparative multilingual broadcasting, covering the Sochi Olympics and the first invasion of Ukraine, covering the protests that emerged, but wasn't covered by broadcasts, but was covered on then Twitter, right? So international broadcasting and social media, quantitative 4 weeks of broadcasting analysis, Twitter traffic, network analysis, and then close qualitative case studies about the protest movements that did break the broadcasting narrative or did overtake certain memes on Twitter, now X. Moving on from that, what happened was, despite how rigorously the team of 9 that we were put that study together, we kept seeing errors in our methodology, things that we couldn't capture. And so that became the set of next questions. And that became part of a multilingual, again, news agency production analysis covering the Syrian war with AFP, Reuters, AP, and 2 Russian newswires, Itartas and RIA Novosti. And so again, we've got quantitative metadata tracking the geography, the temporality, breaking news and delayed news and sources, whether it's from press conferences or the like. And then when we see glitches, once again, in those patterns, we zoom in and do close qualitative studies. And to finish off, this basically then led to a wide-reaching project that I've been helping running for the last 2 years, the Beyond Disinformation Project, where we've been looking at the regulation of markets, the regulation of social media, about policy and censorship interventions on the press, and also looking at actual legislation around freedom of expression, online and in person, of protest, about media financing. And this 15-year audit, in this case of Russian legislation backsliding from democracy, I've been using those themes to select different case studies from within much more visual social media output, such as Instagram of Russian media outlets in exile, trying to report on repression inside Russia and all the difficulties in witnessing and telling those stories.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burchell. Dr. Shao?
Well, thank you. Thank you to organizers for organizing this fantastic panel. Thank you all for being here. So kind of going off what Kenzie said, what exactly is media? I'm going to answer this question from a research in a different perspective, which is I mainly study digital media and social media, but I would like to highlight that the meaning of media is quite different in different countries. And that's kind of part of my focus. So personally, I come from Taiwan originally, and now I'm in the United States. So how is media, especially digital media, utilized in these different countries has been a focus of my study. So specifically, I study social and digital media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Line, and Taiwan's PTT, which is a pretty primitive form of media. It's like a DOS format. So what I found here is that these social and digital sites become locations where political discourse, emotional expression, and mobilization occur. And that has kind of been the focus of my study. And specifically, I'm very interested in how the networks on these media form, how they dissolve, and how they congregate together to produce broader social phenomenon. For example, in my studies about United States and East Asia, one of my studies talks about norms and how are these norms produced online in the context of Hong Kong's anti-ELAB movement. So just to go a little bit deeper, and I'll go back to the big picture of my study. In this specific research, conventionally, Hong Kong has been a non-violent protest society. It has been, since the umbrella movement, pretty much committed to nonviolence. And if anybody conducted some kind of violent tactic, it would be heavily criticized. Now, that wasn't exactly the case in the 2019 anti-ELAB movement. Violence was tolerated and justified for a large proportion of the online community. And how exactly does that occur? What are the networks that build up to it that make this shift in broader social norms? That's the type of questions that I'm interested in. These types of questions about how norms are formed on social media, what types of emotions are allowed and even promoted on social media, and how does that lead to broader political phenomenon like collective action and mobilization and protests? Going back up to like a broader scale, I see these media again as networked public spheres that mediate how people encounter news, form identities, and engage in collective action. So going off what Kenzie said, what is a mediatized these days, right? So the way we experience our understanding of politics is not direct through the face-to-face interactions with politicians anymore. That is still a big part, of course, political campaigns, but a larger and larger proportion of society is understanding politics through these mediated communication, not just through media, but also through the networks, the social networks that formulate on social media. So in other words, we can kind of think of this as a kind of multi-layered aspect of people's formation of political understanding. One is the networks on social media, that's a kind of meso level. At a higher level, we're understanding the cultural norms that back up these media. Like how is Line used in the Taiwanese context? So for people who are not familiar with Line, Line is kind of the WhatsApp version in Taiwan. So that's not exactly that, but I think it's a close enough description of what the Line is in Taiwan. And people use it to engage in all kinds of disinformation and debug disinformation in ways that are quite different from WhatsApp in the United States, for example. So I think I diverted a little bit. Let's get back to your question on why are these kinds of media important and how do they affect people's lives politically? Politically, I think in the United States, a lot of my research shows that these platforms often amplify partisan divides. So in other words, the partisan divide on the ground may not even be that big, but the expression and personalized frames that people show on these digital media amplifies that. And I can get more into that, but we have time constraints. But it acts as arenas for contesting truth, particularly on what is a legit protest, how people perceive violence, and what is considered as disinformation. In Taiwan, this is also true, but these kind of digital media have also formulated a new space for civic organizations outside party structures. As seen, for example, in the Sunflower Movement in Taiwan, it really was impossible with digital media. And that kind of repertoire of how to organize on digital media diffused from Taiwan to Hong Kong and kind of back and forth. And that's also part of what my research engages in. In other words, to close, these media are important today because one, they reshape how people interpret political events. Two, they provide tools for grassroots resistance and top-down surveillance. And also, going off of that, it provides the sites for the kind of broader social phenomenon like norms and collective action. It influences not just what people think, but also how they feel and act politically.
Thank you so much. That was really great. Last but not least, Dr. Swindle.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a privilege to hear what both of you are working on. Sounds really great and interesting. I'll add what I've been working on. I think broadly, probably the way I could combine the different projects I have for this panel is to say I study how political actors use media to spread their cultural messages, to try and promote their cultural ideas. So I've had a long-going study about sort of the spread of liberal ideas about gender equality. And there's been good research documenting the spread of those ideas through foreign aid and international organizations. But I try to zoom in and see if that type of information reaches people in sort of the grassroots parts of societies around the world. And so in that research, I focus on Malawi, which is a small, primarily rural country in southeastern Africa. And that study documents how international organizations work with, train, and pay off journalists to promote their activities, to talk about how the UN and other small NGOs are promoting gender equality, and then how to write about violence against women, not to do victim shaming and and things like that. I try to measure that content by reading all the newspapers and quantifying it over time. So you can get day-to-day variation in the number of articles, newspaper articles about these topics. And then I link that to survey data to make an argument about the effects of the media on people's opinions about whether violence against women is morally justified or not. The short answer is yeah, like these international organizations do have an impact on what people say on surveys. But there is some complexity because there's also a lot of other media that's getting into Malawi from other sources, primarily entertainment media, that really brings in gender stereotypical messaging. And people's relative exposure to that type of media has the opposite effect, primarily. So that's one study about liberal media, but more recently, as the world has turned chaotic and more illiberal in the United States and beyond, I've been focusing on messaging about gender and sexuality from how illiberal actors do that. So I've been doing a large study with Chris Velasco, where we've been collecting all the speeches of a major illiberal non-governmental organization called the World Congress of Families. It's a pretty big organization, but kind of operating in the background of these transnational political campaigns. And we've collected data from about 80 different conferences that they've held over the past 30 years. And who are the speakers, which are the major organizations. And then more recently, we've been going through the tedious process of collecting all the text data and trying to analyze key themes and changes over time in that network. The idea is we want to understand what these actors, like what do anti-gender activists want? What are they promoting? Like what types of other illiberal things are they talking about as well? And how are they connecting across the globe? So this network was based through a Russian and US collaboration, but now has spread to all parts of the world, but less so to Asia, I would say, for sure. And then finally, I'm currently really focused on El Salvador and the connection between El Salvador and the US. I've been studying that for 2 or 3 years now, and it's kind of coming to fruition in a way that is faster than I even anticipated. But El Salvador's president represents kind of a new model of an illiberal leader, and the United States is mimicking a lot of his policies or collaborating with him directly. So currently I'm working with folks to gather data on the way he tries to promote his nation through media. So we're just doing sort of content analysis of his TikTok and Instagram to focus on like how is he presenting himself and situating himself as a member of this network, but also as a leader of it, and then how do his ideas diffuse across the Americas. We're seeing a lot of other countries sort of promoting similar policies, and including in the United States. So yeah, broadly, I'm focused on these political actors, how they promote their messages, whether it be liberalism or illiberalism, and definitely with a focus on gender and sexuality.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swindle. It's really interesting to hear all of your different methodological approaches and different geographical areas of focus. I think it's really nice to put them in conversation with each other. For the next question, I'm going to ask all the panelists to talk about what trends or developments you have identified in relation to the media you study and how they relate to politics and culture globally. For instance, how do you see them affecting conflict, national and international politics, or political action more broadly? And for this one, we'll start with Dr. Shao.
Thank you. In terms of trends and development, it's hard to make such a broad case saying this is the trend because like we were just discussing, the way that media is used is so heterogeneous in different countries. I can say that for the places that I study and the places that I kind of know of, so I'm most familiar with the United States, Taiwan, Hong Kong, East Asia, I know broadly about European social media, but there are many parts of the world which I'm not that familiar with. So I'll focus on what I see as some common threads in the space of social and digital media. And what I've observed are the following. First is the fragmentation of digital publics. So often maybe from a newcomer perspective, like social media is often described as one thing. This is the characteristic of social media. But what I've seen here is that people move to different platforms for different purposes and using a kind of overarching theory of social media to describe this is what's going to happen is inaccurate. And again, this is because, like I said, it's the fragmentation of digital publics. Let me give an example. So, for example, in the Hong Kong protest, people often started with more familiar media to the West, such as Twitter or Facebook. But often these are intertwined in a media ecosystem. For example, the kind of broadcasting aspect of the protest, the anti-ELAB protest in Hong Kong, is done on one platform. But then once like LHKG, which is kind of a forum in Hong Kong, like these kind of public forums serve as the broadcasting space of protest information. But that doesn't mean that collective action is organized on those platforms. What often happens is that this digital platform is used for spreading information, but once people find interest that they want to organize a protest, they move to a different platform like Telegram or Signal. So this is the kind of fragmentation that I'm thinking of. Similarly, in Taiwan, when we think about how do we mobilize the movement, what are the big ideas you want to take away from the movement? Facebook is the most common thing because Facebook is just so widely used in Taiwan. But when it comes to organizing, people opt into things like Line, which are more message-based, more intimate, more like one-to-one interactions to formulate ideas and agendas for protest. So in other words, if you're trying to understand what are the politics on digital media, you can't ignore this fragmentation and the linkages between different fragmented spaces. So that's kind of one trend that I see across different societies. The second thing I'll just kind of mention is this idea of emotional framing and effective polarization over issues and politics. And this has become even more and more so. And this has also creeped into the agenda of mass media as well. So there's a lot of literature that talks about how social media and digital media amplifies emotional charging content because that grabs eyeballs, it brings sponsorships and so on and so forth. But this logic has also started to creep into mass media as well. What I'm thinking here when I say emotional framing and effective polarization is that it's not statistics, it's not observed trends that people utilize in their news writing. It's stories, and it's cherry-picking stories that help you establish your argument. So, and this kind of story and personal connections that are based on emotions is getting more and more prevalent in the digital space and also creeping into mass media. The third trend I'll mention is this idea that disinformation has been used more and more and more. This doesn't mean that there's more disinformation around. What do I mean by that? What I mean here is that disinformation is weaponized as a term for contention, regardless of whether the information itself is true or false. And this is, United States, we all know this happens. In Taiwan, it's often the case when people make an argument and you don't agree with them, you don't need to talk about logic. You don't need to talk about the facts that back up the argument. You just simply claim this is disinformation. And that's one of the most effective things. And I've shown that in numerous survey experiments across different studies, that once you throw in the term disinformation and claim that something is disinformation, it automatically reduces dramatically the credibility of the claim, regardless of whether the original claim is valid or not. And this is a trend that I see across the different countries that I study. I'll just stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shao. Dr. Swindle?
Yeah, that was really interesting, Shao. Something I'm seeing that's kind of similar with the World Congress of Families, is what you mentioned with activists in Taiwan, is they will also sort of organize themselves in public media spaces. But then when they actually do their conferences, they like advertise the conference a lot, but then like they hide the actual conference proceedings and stuff. It's like harder to see. Whereas that wasn't the case in the past. They would publish everything online and their speeches would be there. Now it's hard for me to find them. So there is like this sense of like wide mobilization at the beginning and then like going private. The other thing I wanted to say about trends that I'm observing in terms of global media and politics space, that I think might be interesting to others here would be about the US and its connections to other countries right now. So recently, Milei is the president of Argentina, and he gained power recently under an agenda that he would cut a lot of government spending, which sounds familiar. But he used this symbol of taking a chainsaw out and like running around the stage as he's giving a speech with this chainsaw. And he recently, at the most recent CPAC, he brought a gold chainsaw and gave it to Musk. And so Musk is sort of taking on this similar type of identity, right? We're also seeing these similar connections between El Salvador's leader, Nayib Bukele, and the US now, particularly with respect to ICE. So for Bukele, El Salvador had the highest homicide rate in the world, and that was rapidly decreased, and now it's the lowest in the Americas. So just an incredible change in a short period of time. But they basically in like 2 months arrested 100,000 people, which it's a small country, so that's a lot of people. And they declared basically like martial law, a state of exception. So there's no opportunity for folks to get out of prison. But when they did that, they made all these TikTok videos of the military and police arresting all these people and putting them into these big prisons, and the people being shirtless or having their heads shaved and like being in submission. So it was like broadcast. It wasn't hidden. It was like, we're doing this to get the criminals, the alleged criminals, but also like to show off. And that's sort of the same type of thing we're seeing with ICE too. Like, I don't actually know if the number of migrants being deported is necessarily bigger. It seems like it because it's all we're seeing in the media. But it's also because ICE is like promoting it and showing how hard they are. One other similar connection that I'm seeing is El Salvador would commonly post mug shots of particular people who they'd arrested onto Twitter and say their name and their alleged crime. And ICE is doing like the exact same thing. Like even the image is black and white, like it's just carbon copy. So we see these interesting, I think, global trends of like, these illiberal actors are learning from each other and their ideas are spreading. What's politically successful to their base seems to be determining what they're doing. So yeah, I think those things are pretty interesting and going to be pretty relevant in the coming years.
Yeah, thank you both for these really illustrative examples. Last but not least, Dr. Burchell.
Wonderful. So I'm super interested by both of your work. Actually, this is an exciting panel. So, the things that jumped out to me from our first answers, Yuan, you had talked about practices on particular social media platforms, how they congregate together to create broader social norms, and that's one of the things why I really reel back from a Twitter study or an Instagram study or a news study, and I talk about practices, right? So this is practice theory sociology. What do people do? And what do they say they're doing? And also, what do they say they're saying? And what do they say, right? So really whittling it down to just the smallest unit of social relations, right? Of social action. And that allows for a bit of mobility between a platform, between different affordances, between the political context of one type of news media or another type of news media. And Jeffrey, you were talking about that soft power of the spread of liberal ideas through really, through actual independent press, but also, internationally facing press that's supposed to be, says in their mission values, to promote democracy, to promote the, British way of life, or even the Russian way of life. And I go back to, at least for me, when I first saw that the rupture of that sort of liberal narrative globally, again, was collectively in very divisive ways that can, capture hearts and minds, so to speak. So that's sort of one side of it. But then there's another side when it comes to conflict, and I'll try to be brief. There's really been, I saw it in this security apparatus that was the Sochi Olympics. And I saw it replicated in the Donbass and Crimea in our Twitter study and our broadcasting study right away. I saw it in the multi-state conflict that was Syria, with ISIS as well as Assad and Russia, blockading entire zones from any sort of international reporting or witnessing, kidnapping local and regional journalists from within, and then staging spectacles of violence or spectacles of denial or spectacles of doubt that were part of this military conflict. We see the same thing with international reporters being barred from Gaza, right? So we have geographical control that displaces reporting, displaces witnessing, and then suddenly all the stories about Ukraine, about Syria, about Gaza take place in New York, Geneva, Paris, London, Ankara, right? There's a lot of displacement of direct witnessing that's happening there. And so you get limited and delayed reporting on the ground, and this offers strategic points for governments to intervene and bring in their own narratives. And like Jeffrey was saying, bring in their own content, bring their own, 360-degree advertisement for the success of their latest military initiative. And what this represents is the real weak autonomy of the press, Bourdieu's concept, being used as part of geopolitics, right? So we're not seeing just divergent narratives. We're seeing whole balkanized blockades of the informational landscape, whole referential systems, whole epistemological approaches. How do we know things that are undermining each other and not overlapping? And the goal, it seems, of these disinforming or of this balkanization of the informational landscape is not to win hearts and minds, but it's to gain traction with the maybe sympathetic and uncertain audiences of other systems and other regions. And just to end this idea, this is where in 2022, with the full invasion of Ukraine and the immediate sanctions, we see a real fragmentation of what was once a sort of free trade, neoliberal, unipolar world. And this, again, in sociology has precedent, right? Saskia Sassen was already talking about territory, authority, and rights, and how Western powers could expel economies and governments from that unified system. Following 2016, Paulo Gerbuda talked about the great recoil from the global economy and global politics and the neo-statism or the protectionism that comes with that, right? And we're seeing that play out very forcefully now, where we see these balkanized, regionalized, multipolar worlds. And then finally, for the media perspective of it, I think of Andreas Hepp's work, who says, don't think about national, don't think about the American media, don't think about the Russian media, a national media economy. Think about these networks of actors, largely in capitals, working for media organizations, dependent on other networks of actors across borders and not defined necessarily by the political legal regime that they're under. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those were all really informative reflections on sort of the way these things are connecting. I do want to apologize one more time for the unexpected material that got shared. It's just a small taste of the digital public sphere, we could say. For our last question, I'm going to ask the panelists to speak a little bit about the historical dimensions of the phenomena you observe. For example, how are the trends or developments that you're thinking about similar to or different from previous political moments? We might also think about how historical legacies, such as post-socialism and post-colonialism, affect how public spheres take shape. We also might think about how specificities of language and culture, and I know we've touched on this a bit, impact these developments and what we might expect going forward. And we'll start with Dr. Swindle.
Thanks, Emma. I'm glad that you sent this question in advance because I found it to be really difficult for me. But even still, I don't feel like I have a good grasp on this. To me, I feel like there is a rupture in there's obviously some similarities with the growth of illiberalism and parallels to, you know, Hitler or other genocides that have happened historically. The authoritarian playbook is similar, but there also feels like there's differences in just the nature of media that are quite make this period quite unexpected, at least to me. I don't feel like I have a sense of like where things are going to go with global media in the future and its relationship to politics. One thing that I do want to mention before I pass the baton to others is something that I haven't paid attention to, but this question caused me to reflect on is just who controls the media companies. And the reason why I've reflected on that is just because of what has happened with Twitter or X. And like, it's just a completely different online space than it was just a few months ago. And so I think understanding the finances of media is going to be a really crucial aspect of things moving forward. But I'd like to hear what others have to say on this question, mostly.
Thank you for that, Dr. Burchell.
So I've got one of those contradictory, not satisfying answers of it's completely changed and it's exactly the same. So one of the things, you know, if we look at the last 30 years, this, again, global media sphere, which has been radically shaken up in the global political sphere as well, radically shaken up in the last just 2-3 years, maybe it's an aberration, right? It's not being balkanized, it's being re-balkanized, often strategically by governments and corporations seeking their domestic dominance of regional, linguistic, as well as cross-linguistic transnational domains, right? So this is what James Crary would call like a control revolution, right? Not just a revolution as in a big upheaval, but like a revolution geometrically, right? Around the sun, back to the starting point, but with a deeper level of complexity. So new technologies unleash a bit of chaos, a lot of crises, and then they're wrested back under control with another layer of technological innovation or political technologies that sort of wrest control from the crisis in a certain way. You know, when it comes to the news media, we go back 100 years, and Heidi Tvorek's work on Germany and Britain competing over telegraphy, right? The telegraph in war. And one of the ways that Germany in World War I and World War II gained some dominance was wireless telegraph and literally cutting the undersea cables of the British telegraph, right? So we see that like disruptive technologies, you know, wireless was mastered by the Germans, and then suddenly news agencies, which for 50 years, 60, maybe 80 years at that point, had been part of cartels with particular metropolitan newspapers on different continents that really balkanized the world into really narrative cartels. You know, if you went with Reuters or Wolf, those narratives would go to South America and differentially to North America. And it was in that context during World War II when suddenly everyone could see that the news agencies were taking the line of their respective governments or their respective allied governments, that the disruptor, the BBC, forcefully emerged, right? And so moving away from that, so that's the sort of, the internet as we know it, the global media sphere from the 1980s with satellite technology, and then the internet in the 90s. Really, it's being re-balkanized back to its sort of the status quo that has been in place pretty much for like 300 years. But then the other aspect is that if politics was mediatized, if political participation and political campaigning became media practices and became, media output, we have to understand that the media landscape during that time has also become incredibly financialized, right? Because it's not just the news media, it is tech, it is social media, it is supply chains, it is digital advertising, data brokerage firms, right? It is the data centers and the populations within these, regional markets of, Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, et cetera, or Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, right? We were seeing the data, the content production also becoming this vast new resource for AI that is a competitive political and military resource. So if politics was mediatized and the media landscape has become financialized, then what is politics now? And it seems to be part and parcel of regulating, managing, and capturing markets. And where does that leave us, the populations? It feels like we're just data producing resources now. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Shao.
Thank you. Like Jeffrey, I think this is an interesting reflective question. I'll try to answer through a comparative perspective, because to understand the historical impact on either media or politics, I think comparative approach helps to highlight those differences. So I'm going to focus on the United States and Taiwan in this case. I do think there are two aspects where the historical aspect comes in, and I'll start with the United States. Let me start with the topic. First, whether the media is politicized and to what degree. So in the United States has been a democracy for hundreds of years. It has established a very strong two-party system where those parties have been antagonistic, although even more so in the recent 20 to 30 years. Given that context, a lot of the digital media space falls into that kind of two-party conflict framing. Whereas in Taiwan, the main development, so Taiwan, brief history of Taiwan, it was colonialized by Japan, and then it became an authoritarian government, and then it became democratized. So it doesn't have that kind of two-party development system. And when the internet kind of started to take off, it was kind of seen as a neutral space for activists and public actors to find their place to organize collective action. And there's a deliberate distancing from political parties, and more effective. If we compare that historical trend to the United States, it's very difficult for media, either social media or mass media, to say we are party neutral. I mean, I think it's partially true, but because of the historical context of the two-party system and its ramifications, the perceptions from the audience may not see it that way. So even neutral media can be seen as politicized, whereas I don't think that's that much of that case in Taiwan, which leads to the second thing where I think this kind of differences in historical development, like, is it a young democracy or is it like a, democracy for hundreds of years? The second part is, who is the imagined audience? So going back to what Kenzie was saying, what are the practices on media? For the United States, the imagined audience is often people within the United States. It's focused on inward topics like race, immigration, economy. If we compare that with even when people are organizing collective action in Taiwan, there's an imagined audience of the so-called Western audience. So whether the framing of the protests, whether the goals would resonate with media in the United States. Give an example, in the Sunflower Movement, a lot of protesters got a lot of donations and bought part of the front page of the New York Times. Why would they do that? You wouldn't imagine for example, protests in the United States to buy the front page of let's say, The Guardian in the UK. It's just not a thing. So I think it's kind of interesting, like who is imagined audience and how does that increase the credibility? So for Taiwan as a young democracy and less politicized, the imagined audience is not only people within Taiwan, but having so-called Western media like the New York Times back it up would increase the credibility and say, hey, this is a legit protest. Whereas in the United States, I don't think that's that of a thing. And I think that goes back to the historical roots of where this is developed and when it was developed. Now, the question of what we expect going forward, I think as these kind of digital platforms become more multinational, there'll be a convergence of these types of things. So what I've seen in Taiwan in the past couple of years is that media has become more and more politicized, just kind of in like the United States. So I do think there's a cultural norm diffusion. I don't know if it's a good way or bad way, but I think it's happening to some extent. Hopefully I'm wrong, but who can speculate about the future?
Thank you all so much for those really thoughtful answers. This has been a really great hearing you answer this. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Velichkova for the audience Q&A and wrap up.
I want to thank everyone for your insightful comments. And now we'll open it up for questions. Any questions from the audience?
Feel free to message or raise your hand if you'd like to unmute, and I can unmute you or put your question in the chat.
Could I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Yuan, what you were talking about with Taiwan and its unique relationship with, say, the New York Times, does that kind of structure all politics there? Like, because of, well, like Taiwan is so focused, I imagine, on independence from China. And so whichever political party can demonstrate that America is on their side is likely to win the popular sentiment. Is that, or how does that play out? It just feels like it would be central to everything given the desire for independence.
Yes, it's not just the United States, it's a whole bunch of countries. So whenever Taiwan, I think it's also due to geopolitics, like whether people recognize Taiwan, how people recognize Taiwan, and in what way. So anytime a Taiwanese political event is, let's say, reported, let's say by The Guardian, by the New York Times, or somewhere else, it's seen as a positive thing to have that kind of foreign exposure. And the people on the ground, the grassroots people, often have a media division targeted. A lot of people in Taiwan have very good English, especially English and German and some other foreign countries. So what I see in the protests, and some of them I'm part of, is there's this media division where they would recruit people who have very good foreign language expertise and write explicit press conferences for the major newspapers or media around the world to say this is, and it increases legitimacy. So I think there's that kind of imagination of the government still as partially authoritarian, because the democratization of Taiwan happened in 1988, which was not, I mean, it's kind of long ago, but it's not that long ago. So having the kind of foreign exposure to back it up, saying that we are true fighters against a government that's trying to oppress the people, that kind of imagination is still there. So I think that explains part of it. Although I have zero evidence for this, it's just kind of a sentiment that I have observed in the digital media space in Taiwan. It could also be because Taiwan has been colonized by so many countries, Japan, Spain, Netherlands in the more distant past, and recently the KMT government as well. So yeah, that's my kind of half-hearted answer.
Michael, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think that yeah, all of your research is wonderful. I'm one of one of the things I use in my own research is content analysis or media analysis, and I think of media being the message, Marshall McLuhan, right? And then thinking of global world and how some major social forces play into the message that media is sending. I guess one question that I have for you is uh, how has this changed the game for me for the study of media in a global world where we have access to almost any country's media by the click of a website or even some of the different devices that we use connecting to our TVs where you can go to uh, these little apps or programs and go to television in any city or country.
So I actually think in many ways that's a lot of what all three of us are speaking about, right? There's a it's Yuan was talking about the need for the comparative element in order to understand actually the meaning from within a population or within a region or within an electorate. And Jeffrey was talking about, okay, well, we've got these liberal narratives and their diffusion, but what about the illiberal narratives, right? It's almost like we can't define the edges of one without understanding the other. And then suddenly we realize we're talking about an entire informational landscape. And it works the same, I think, with platforms or mediums or technologies, right? The medium is the message, but they're not isolated. And people are connected to they're connected to an informational milieu. And there are practices involved that are meaningful and political and expressive and monetized about shifting between mediums. And so there's almost a social set of practices of managing our media intake across languages, across platforms, managing our interpersonal life, connecting and disconnecting in multiple ways at multiple times. And at least for me as a researcher, it took a while to see that because we always started, inside a particular case study or inside a particular narrative or inside a particular modal analysis or platform analysis. And when we figured out what was happening there, we could see that it was actually connected to, so many other aspects of the information landscape.
So a combination of zooming in and zooming out, I think, is that what I'm hearing? Yes.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And realizing that there's a greater horizon and a greater set of perspectives and, dips and valleys, et cetera.
Thank you.
I think we have
Did
time
I
for
res-
one more question. Sorry.
I'm
Go
not
ahead.
sure Yuan and Jeffrey wanted to respond to the last one as well.
Well, I'll just make it brief because I have to go in like 5-6 minutes. My apologies. So I'll just say one thing, which is this access to different media partially is due to because the homogenization of these multinational digital media companies like Twitter. So people in the United States use Twitter, people in Japan use Twitter. The major newspapers in Japan use Twitter, and that's also the case in the United States. And what that opens up is something we didn't talk about in this panel at all, which is bots. So what happens is, according to a large body of bot research, what happens is these accounts, they use computational propaganda in one language in a specific platform, but they can use exactly the same thing because it's the same platform in another country, just translating the language. So what you often see is, for example, bots in the United States spreading disinformation. They do it in France using the exact same playbook. They just kind of change a few things. Same accounts, but people don't recognize. You don't know whether a bot is from France or is it from the United States, and that just kind of happens.
Jeffrey, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, briefly. Michael, that was a great question. Thank you. I think, like, on the one hand, we do see like all of this, like, sort of where every country can use Twitter. But on the other hand, I think the case of TikTok in the United States shows that like we're not really sure how these illiberal leaders are going to deal with this. Like, I think that, for example, my personal opinion, but I haven't followed it very closely, is that Trump decided to not enforce the law banning TikTok because he thought that TikTok might be politically beneficial for him somehow. But if that switched, he will just ban it, and he'll just make everyone use Truth Social or something, or it would be like balkanization. I don't know to what extent you can control that these days, but like I feel like it's going to be this simultaneous like convergence, everyone on the same media platforms across the world, but also like efforts to restrain that when it's politically in your interest to do so.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the answer to that question. It's interesting because it seems like there's never an end in terms of opportunities for somebody to engage in media. And when one starts to gain a bad reputation or something, there's always another one that steps in for its place. Blue Sky is what I'm thinking of right now.
Thank you all for your participation. We've reached the hour and we have promised to finish on time. So unfortunately, we'll have to cut it short, but this is an invitation for everyone to continue the conversation offline and maybe during future panels online or in person. So thank you all for participating in this panel as panelists or as moderators or observers. It has been a fascinating talk. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks
very
everyone
much.
for your participation. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Emma. Bye.
Emma, would you stop recording?
Yes. Okay.